May I ask all to take their seats, please, to start the segment of this session? Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the 23rd meeting of the 36th session of the Human Rights Council. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that the deadline for submission of draft resolution is today at 1 p.m. As I explained yesterday, any request for extension should be explained and communicated before the deadline to the Secretariat and will be approved by the Council only under exceptional circumstances. The extension will be granted only once for a maximum of 24 hours. In this connection, I would like to inform you that the requests for the extension of the deadline has been made by the following delegations for tabling the draft resolutions: Côte d'Ivoire on the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the applications for human rights of environmentally sound management and disposal of hazardous substances and wastes. The European Union on the human rights situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Explanations have been provided. With your approval, an extension for tabling these two draft resolutions will be granted until 1 p.m. tomorrow. I take it that this is agreeable to all of you. We will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of Morocco based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of Morocco. As contained in document A/HRC/36/6 and A/HRC/36/6/Addendum 1. This report and its addendum, together with the additional information that will now be provided by Morocco, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mustafa Rahmed, State Minister in charge of Human Rights of Morocco, to present additional information on the review. I thank His Excellency for this statement. You have the floor.
In the name of God Almighty, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, members of the working group in charge of the UPR, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Human Rights Council, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me pleasure at the outset, on behalf of the Government of the Kingdom of Morocco, to extend my thanks and appreciation to His Excellency, the President of the Human Rights Council, and the ladies and gentlemen, the members of the Working Group on the UPR, and all members of the Human Rights Council for all the efforts they exert in order to promote and enhance the protection of human rights. And my delegation is honored to take part in this session dedicated to the adoption of the report of the Working Group on the UPR of Morocco, and I seize this opportunity to commend and to welcome the outcomes of the constructive and fruitful dialogue witnessed during the session in which the national report was adopted last May. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Morocco expresses its deep concern and deep appreciation for the interest given to all tracks of legislative and institutional reforms in the field of human rights in Morocco during this review, which Morocco has pursued by amending the 2011 constitution so as to be commensurate with the review, especially the safeguards that were set in the field of the promotion and the protection of human rights, which has also been reflected in numerous questions and observation directed to the Kingdom regarding the civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, as well as the rights of certain segments in the society, and cooperation with the United Nations mechanism and relevant policies, strategies and programs. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, when the draft of the report of the working group was issued, the State Minister in charge of human rights has embarked on cooperation and coordination and consultation with all stakeholders in an interactive dialogue during May in order to safeguard its effective implementation in accordance with the strategic planning principles. And during this process, a consultative approach was adopted regarding human rights, as is common in the Kingdom of Morocco, including interaction with United Nations specialized agencies and ongoing consultations. In this respect, as stated in the document presented by the Kingdom of Morocco to the Human Rights Council on its position regarding the aforementioned recommendations, 191 out of 244 recommendations were fully supported, namely 78% of the total number of recommendations, including 23 recommendations that the Kingdom of Morocco has implemented fully, and 168 recommendations that are within implementation. And it has taken into consideration 44 recommendations, namely 18% of the total. And 9 recommendations have not been accepted because it considers that they do not fall within the mandate of the Human Rights Council. And the Kingdom of Morocco confirms its position regarding the recommendations. It has accepted some of them fully, partially, or rejected some of them within international standards and the provisions of its constitution and international resolutions. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Morocco has spared no effort since the national report was put forward on the 2nd of May 2017 in order to enhance the legal and institutional framework in the field of human rights. And it adopted in the same month, May 2017, the draft law 76/15 on the National Council of Human Rights for being the national independent institution that is in charge of the implementation and the promotion of human rights in the country, and has taken several measures in order to put an end to torture and protect children and people with disabilities. It has also adopted during the same period law number 1416 on behalf of the Al-Wasit institution, being a national independent institution specialized in mediation between different stakeholders. And the draft law is currently being reviewed by the Parliament. And the enhancement of the functions of these two institutions is considered to be a qualitative leap in the enhancement of national mechanisms and an effective implementation of its international commitments that result from its adherence to the additional relevant protocols, especially when it comes to the combating of torture and the protection of fragile and disadvantaged individuals and groups. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, concerning the specificities related to human rights which require ongoing monitoring and concerted efforts, the Kingdom of Morocco has held a number of workshops and training courses in this field based on strategic planning, and it reiterates its commitment to implement all the recommendations that it had supported, and it hopes that this session would be an opportunity to objectively and constructively assess the reality of human rights in the kingdom and to review the accomplishments and the gains achieved in this field, as well as the challenges faced that require further action and concerted efforts by all stakeholders in order to overcome them, thanks to an intensification of international cooperation. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Kingdom of Morocco, I would like to extend to you all and to all members of the working group on the review of the UPR and all participating delegations, to extend to you all our thanks for your interest and your concern and the time you dedicated to the discussion and the adoption of this report. And I would like to seize this opportunity also to extend my thanks to the Secretariat and the Troika members and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for all their efforts in order to make the UPR a success. Thank you very much once again.
I thank His Excellency for this statement. In accordance with paragraph 13 of Human Rights Council Resolution 16/21, I will now give the floor to the representative of the National Council for Human Rights of Morocco.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. The National Human Rights Council of the Kingdom of Morocco is honoured to contribute to this session on adoption of the UPR report. The Commission welcomes the position of the government with regards the 191 recommendations adopted and declares itself willing to step up its cooperation with all stakeholders for implementation of recommendations in its mandate. On the recommendations on the treaty-based practice, the constitutional framework, particularly when it comes to equality, combating discrimination, economic, social and cultural rights, public freedoms, and penal legislation, the Commission will continue its efforts at monitoring, in assessing public policy, and on reporting, particularly as part of the Protocol of Understanding concluded with the Parliament in 2014, which is based on the national constitution and on international instruments, human rights instruments, that have been ratified by our country. On human rights education, the Commission, thanks to its Human Rights Training Institute, remains willing to bolster the capacities of state actors, including civil society organizations, public and private enterprises. As to the recommendations that weren't accepted by the government, the Commission reaffirms its favourable position on the abolition of capital punishment and recalls the recommendation of the Reconciliation Council with regards to the Rome Statute, reiterates moreover its recommendation regarding gender equality, including when it comes to succession rights, and causing the government to step up its action to protect vulnerable groups from violence and discrimination, including protecting LGBT people. The Commission reiterates that it works in full independence to protect and promote human rights throughout the country through its 13 regional commissions. We trust that the Parliament, which will open in a month's time, will help adopt the UPR, which will allow the reforms to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to the member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review, I would like to inform you that the speaking time has been set at 1 minute and 30 seconds for all states. I will now open the floor to member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of review. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. في البداية نرحب.
Thank you, Vice President. First, we'd like to wish a warm welcome to Mr. Mustafa Ramad, the Human Rights Minister, and we welcome the Moroccan delegation. We commend the achievements of Morocco in the field of human rights. We also commend the efforts made by the government in promoting and protecting human rights. The fact that Morocco has agreed to a large number of recommendations shows which 191 recommendations. This highlights Morocco's commitment to promoting human rights, both civil, political, social and cultural rights. The delegation of my country commends the progress achieved by the Moroccan government, a kindred government, and recommends that the Council should approve the report. We wish Morocco further success and prosperity. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Afghanistan welcomes the delegation of Morocco and commend the implementation of the recommendations previously received from the various international human rights mechanisms. We noted that important steps have been taken by the government of Morocco to ensure the promotion and protection of human rights for its citizens, as well as its ratification of the human rights conventions and optional protocols. We also welcome that the government extended invitations to the special mandate holders to visit Morocco and the government efforts to reform the justice system and enhance the rule of law across the country. Mr. Vice President, my delegation also commends the legislative and institutional reforms made by the government of Morocco in the area of the civil and political rights that guaranteed the fundamental rights and freedoms, in particular the framework law on persons with disability and draft law on combating violence against women. Finally, my delegation calls on the Council to adopt the national report of Morocco and wishes the delegation of Morocco the best in the process of implementation of the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Albania welcomes the delegation of Morocco in the Human Rights Council. We thank His Excellency Mr. Hamid, State of Minister of Morocco, for its presentation today, and we encourage the Kingdom of Morocco on the report of their UPR-ECOM. We are pleased to acknowledge that Morocco has accepted a considerable number of recommendations during its review and has an ongoing engagement to the human rights. Albania trusts that the government of Morocco will continue its positive efforts toward improving enjoyment of human rights in line with its international commitments and UPR recommendations. We endorse the adoption of the UPR Working Group's report on Morocco by the Council and look forward to its successful implementation of accepted recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Chair. Azerbaijan welcomes the delegation of Morocco and thanks the esteemed delegation for the update provided with regard to the recommendations received. Azerbaijan takes note of Morocco's achievements in the field of promotion and protection of human rights. It is remarkable that Morocco has accepted most of the recommendations submitted during the 27th session of the UPR Working Group. In this regard, we congratulate Morocco for its successful and productive UPR process. Azerbaijan recommends the Council to adopt the outcome of the UPR of Morocco and wishes the Kingdom of Morocco further successes in implementation of the accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. أود في البداية أن أرحب.
Thank you, Vice President. First, I'd like to wish a warm welcome to the Moroccan delegation headed by Mr. Mustafa Hamid, the State Minister in charge of Human Rights of Morocco. I want to thank them for participating in the 36th session of the Human Rights Council. We thank him for his comprehensive presentation on the country's responses to the recommendations from the third UPR and for providing us with the latest developments in Morocco in terms of protecting and promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms and implementation of the UPR recommendations. Bahrain commends Morocco's serious commitment to human rights as manifested by its acceptance of the majority of the recommendations submitted during the third UPR. We're talking about 191 recommendations, including recommendations submitted by my own delegation. We are convinced that Morocco will continue its efforts in years to come to implement the recommendations that the country agreed to. In conclusion, we call on the Council to approve the working group, the UPR working group report on Morocco, and we wish Morocco further success when it comes to upholding human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you, Vice President. Belgium welcomes positively Morocco's commitment to the current UPR, as reflected by the presence of the Minister of State today and its acceptance of so many recommendations. We reiterate our appreciation for Morocco's efforts in implementing the recommendations of previous cycles. My delegation also takes note with appreciation of the fact that a recommendation formulated by Belgium was accepted, indeed already implemented. This was the recommendation on accelerating the process of adoption of a draft law on violence against women. This is a key law for furthering the rights of women and for their protection, including from conjugal violence. Belgium will continue to be mindful of the follow-up to this process. Belgium, however, does take note with regret of the fact that its two other recommendations were not accepted by Morocco. The first regarding repeal of Article 490 of the Criminal Code criminalizing sexual relations outside of marriage, and the second regarding ratification of the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Belgium believes that these are two important recommendations and calls on the authorities to reconsider their position on these 2 points. It also encourages the authorities to actively pursue the national debate on the issue of the death penalty with a view to its abolition. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Botswana.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Botswana welcomes the delegation of Morocco to the adoption of the UPR outcome and for the additional information provided today. We welcome Morocco's action plan aimed at implementing the accepted recommendations, including Botswana's recommendation on women's rights during their second review. We further welcome the steps undertaken to improve laws and policies aimed at advancing women's equal participation in the public domain, as well at the family level, and applaud Morocco's undertaking to integrate a gender perspective in development policies and programs. We also commend Morocco's continued cooperation with the United Nations human rights mechanisms, demonstrated amongst others by hosting of human rights forums and several mandate holders. In conclusion, Botswana supports the adoption of Morocco's UPR outcome and wishes them success in the implementation of accepted recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of China.
Vice President, the Chinese delegation appreciates Morocco's constructive participation in the UPR process. China welcomes that Morocco has adopted the Charter of Judicial System Reform, aiming to strengthen the protection of human rights in the judicial system, has formulated the strategic plan on sustainable development 2015 to 2020 to promote economic and social development, has enhanced the social protection to protect these people's right to health, education, housing and cultural rights, has made efforts to protect the rights of women, children and people with disabilities, and has adopted measures to protect migrants' rights and combat human trafficking. China thanks Morocco for accepting the recommendations made by China and hopes that Morocco will continue to promote economic and social development and improve people's living standard, laying a solid foundation for the enjoyment of all human rights. China supports the endorsement of the UPR report of Morocco by the Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci.
Thank you, Vice President. Côte d'Ivoire wishes a warm welcome to the Moroccan delegation at this meeting devoted to the adoption of its UPR report. My delegation commends the efforts made by Morocco to improve the human rights situation in that country and encourages it to pursue its cooperation with the international community, in particular with the Council mechanisms, in order to consolidate and safeguard the gains achieved in that sphere. My delegation in that respect thanks the Moroccan government for taking into account recommendations formulated as part of the review and calls on it to take all necessary steps to ensure their implementation and the protection of human rights. Moreover, Côte d'Ivoire calls on Morocco to pursue its close cooperation with the UN mechanisms in that sphere. Vice President, while wishing every success to the Moroccan government, my delegation remains convinced that implementation of the recommendations from this review will allow significant progress to be achieved in the field of human rights in that country. In conclusion, my country calls on the Council to proceed to the adoption of the final report of the Moroccan UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Egypt welcomes the fraternal delegation of Morocco headed by Mr. Mustafa Roumeid, State Minister for Human Rights. We wish to congratulate them for the successful Universal Periodic Review process, which came as a fruit for the appreciable effort by Morocco on the back of interactive dialogue, extensive discussions and transparent cooperation with various government parties as well as CSOs. We also congratulate the delegation of Morocco for accepting 194 recommendations out of 244. We also thank the delegation of Morocco for accepting the recommendations submitted by Egypt. In this respect, we commend the high attention attached by Morocco for the protection and promotion of human rights and their efforts deployed on this respect, especially the adoption of a large number of laws, as well as taking important steps to reform the judiciary and the creation of various national mechanisms to promote human rights. We call upon Morocco to continue their assiduous efforts to protect and promote human rights. In conclusion, we wish our brothers in Morocco all success in implementing the accepted recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia warmly welcomes the delegation of the Kingdom of Morocco to this UPR session. We thank the delegation for the oral update just now. We note with satisfaction Morocco for accepting considerable number of recommendations, including Ethiopian recommendation to continue allocating the required fund for the implementation of projects to increase the integration of human rights into public policies. Ethiopia appreciates Morocco for its principled advancement in the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Finally, Mr. President, by encouraging Morocco to continue its engagement with the Human Rights Council, Ethiopia supports the adoption of the UPR outcome of the Kingdom of Morocco. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Gabon.
Vice-Président.
Thank you, Vice President. We wish to welcome the delegation of Morocco and we commend them for the presentation of their final report. Gabon is pleased with the commitment of the Moroccan government to give effect to the recommendations accepted in its time before the UPR in 2017 in May. The government particularly welcomes the actions taken to favor the fight against poverty and disparity and vulnerability in the entirety of the kingdom, to include the South. We also welcome the legislative and institutional reforms that lead to the adoption of a code on press and publications and the framework law on persons with disabilities and the law on human trafficking. In conclusion, the Gabonese delegation encourages the Kingdom of Morocco to continue its efforts in implementing the recommendations from the last May UPR. We invite the Council to adopt the report. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Ghana welcomes the Kingdom of Morocco to the adoption of its UPR report. Ghana notes with satisfaction the approval by the Parliament of Morocco of the first optional protocol to the ICCPR and the optional protocol to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women for subsequent ratification. Ghana also welcomes Morocco's adoption of a Charter on Justice Reform to consolidate the efficiency and the independence of the judiciary. In its vein, Ghana encourages Morocco to continue with ongoing efforts to strengthen the respect for human rights and rule of law in the country. Ghana endorses the adoption of the UPR report of the Kingdom of Morocco and wishes the government of Morocco every success on the implementation of the accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of India.
India welcomes the delegation of Morocco for the adoption of their third UPR report and thanks them for the presentation. We note with appreciation the frank and open manner in which Morocco participated in its review process. We express hope that the delegation of Morocco has benefited from the interactions during the course of its review in the working group and that the government of Morocco will apply constructively all the recommendations that enjoy its support in order to further improve human rights standards of all its peoples. We would like to highlight that Morocco has created a large number of jobs and the unemployment rate has decreased, reaching 8.6% in 2016. Morocco has launched a plan for incorporating youths into the labour market, which has resulted in more than 100,000 posts for young people in the private sector. We commend Morocco for the implementation of the Green Programme, which aimed to achieve an increase in people working in the agricultural sector by 16%. We are happy to recommend the adoption of its UPR report and wish Morocco all success in the future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
My delegation would like to congratulate the government of Morocco for adoption. It's not working. Okay. Mr. Vice President, my delegation would like to congratulate the government of Morocco for the adoption of its UPR report. We are also appreciative of Morocco's firm commitment to make progress in human rights improvements on the ground and its continued engagement in the UPR process. Indonesia is pleased to note that Morocco has accepted 191 recommendations out of the 244 recommendations received during the 27th session of the UPR Working Group, and of which 168 of the 191 accepted recommendations are already in the process of implementation. Indonesia would also like to thank the government of Morocco for accepting all of Indonesia's recommendations during the working group, as they are already included in the 168 recommendations that are already in the implementation phase. At the same token, we also would like to convey that all of Morocco's recommendations for Indonesia during the same UPR working group session also enjoyed the support of Indonesia. Such close collaboration demonstrated through the UPR process simply indicates the success of the UPR mechanisms, which states can work together in a constructive and mutual relation to advance human rights causes. Mr. Vice President, last but not least, Indonesia fully supports the Council's decision to adopt the report of the working group of the UPR of Morocco. We wish the people and government of Morocco success in implementing all of its accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Shukran, Naib al-Rais.
Mr. Vice President, Iraq wishes to thank the Kingdom of Morocco for its attention to the situation of human rights in Morocco. We hail the report and we hail Morocco having accepted the recommendations. The delegation from my country would like to recommend to the Council that it adopted the report from the UPR from Morocco. We hail that Morocco has accepted the majority of the recommendations from the UPR. I thank you.
Representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Vice President. I would like to also welcome the Minister of State for Human Rights, I would like to also welcome his delegation. We commend them for participating in this human rights session. We would like to thank them for the presentation on their recommendations accepted during their previous UPR, as well as on the progress made in human rights and fundamental freedoms. Morocco is on the route to implementing the recommendations that have been accepted. We hail Morocco, which has adopted the majority of the recommendations, including that's from Jordan, which reflects the commitment of Morocco to promote and protect human rights as well as fundamental freedoms. We are convinced that Morocco will continue its efforts in the years that lie ahead in adopting or in implementing the recommendations adopted. We recommend that the Council adopt the report from the working group on the UPR results from Morocco. Concluding, we wish Morocco the best of success in their efforts to be deployed under the Convention. Thank you.
Thank you. This was unfortunately the last state speaker we can accommodate. As per the new practice, all statements, including those which could not be delivered due to time constraints, should have been uploaded online. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments. Now I call on Africa Cultural International.
Africa Culture International Human Rights accueille la délégation du Maroc.
We welcome the delegation from Morocco, and we appreciate their efforts to implement the recommendations contained in the report from the working group from the last session of the UPR. We also recognize that the government of Morocco has been supporting freedom and freedom of speech and the press, as guaranteed by the Moroccan Constitution. Morocco has continued to support the programs that are aimed at protecting the rights of its people with the support of the local community. Morocco has also built a free sanitary infrastructure throughout the country. This mix gives access to women, children, and vulnerable individuals that could otherwise not have had access. We also hail the efforts of the country to effectively implement childcare efforts and to bring about the law on protection that was recommended in the previous session of the UPR, stressing education, basic education for children. However, we encourage Morocco to continue to allow for free speech with no restrictions and protect the journalists and human rights defenders. We encourage them also to cooperate actively with member states, including in the African Union, in order to improve the political, economic, and social situation in the country. We wish the best for Morocco as regards these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the International Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We were extremely disappointed to read of Morocco's partial rejection of Kenya's recommendation that Morocco remove International Human and Ethical Union.
What's going on?
Yes, yes.
Et de remettre le chrono à 2 minutes.
Ah oui,
oui.
Now I call on the International Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Et demande de remettre le chrono à 2 minutes.
Ok, c'est bon.
C'est bon. Thank you, Mr. President. The Western Sahara is an integral part of the decolonization agenda. The General Assembly, in its successive resolutions, has stressed the right of all people to self-determination, which is something that requires to be respected. The acknowledgement of the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the other UN agencies of the legitimacy of the aspirations of citizens of non-self-governing territories in practicing the right and self-determination imposes the obligation to provide them with all necessary assistance. All these calls have fallen on deaf ears by the Kingdom of Morocco. The weak legal basis of the Moroccan call regarding the Western Sahara was recently challenged by a decision of the highest legislative authority in Europe, namely the EU Court of Justice, which issued its famous verdict on the 21st of December 2016, stating that all Morocco's allegations are null and void regarding the Western Sahara, and that the Western Sahara is an independent part separate from the Kingdom of Morocco. Hence, it should not be part of the agreements that are held with the EU. Hence, we call upon the Human Rights Council to refuse all the Moroccan calls to include the Western Sahara in its new administrative distribution. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Now I call on American Association of Jurists.
I thank you, Mr. Vice President. I speak on behalf of a group of 8 NGOs. With reference to NGOs' written statements number 9, 49, 76, 120, 121 and 123, we wish to call upon the attention of the Council's members on the human rights and international humanitarian law violations in the non-self-governing territory of Western Sahara, illegally occupied by the Kingdom of Morocco. The invasion of the territory, which the Security Council and the General Assembly have deplored, compels the Kingdom to respect international humanitarian law. We take note of the numerous and serious breaches of Articles 31, 32, 33, 49, 53, 66 and 76 of the 4th Geneva Convention. In regretting that too few members of the working group have paid due attention to the serious and continuous human rights violations in the occupied territory of Western Sahara, we call on the attention of the Council's members on the violations of the inalienable right to self-determination and sovereignty over natural resources, the right to peaceful assembly and association, and on the right to freedom of opinion and expression of those advocating for the implementation of UNGA Resolution 1514 on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. We also stress the violation of the principles of independence of judges and lawyers, as demonstrated in the proceedings on what is known as the Périodique trial, during which the judges had to disregard the internationally recognized legal status of Western Sahara, and the French lawyers were expelled because of referring to it. We call on the Human Rights Council to recommend to the Kingdom of Morocco to agree on the establishment of a permanent human rights monitoring mechanism in Western Sahara within the MINURSO mandate, to respect the legal status of Western Sahara and to abide to the rules of the international humanitarian law. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Now I call on the International Humanist and Ethical Union.
Vice President, we were extremely disappointed to read of Morocco's partial rejection of Kenya's recommendation that Morocco remove restrictive practices against Christians and other minorities, including limitation on religious activities, freedom of thought and conscience. Notably, it was the only recommendation regarding the right to freedom of religion or belief. Such a reform is sorely needed. The state maintains a law prohibiting expression deemed critical of Islam and the institution of the monarchy. In the past year, the government had reportedly arrested, detained and questioned local non-Muslims about their belief, and authorities arrested and sentenced several individuals for eating and smoking in public during Ramadan. Since the campaign against such fasting laws in 2009 and the publication of a fatwa calling for the murder of or execution of apostates, the non-religious have become an increasingly visible persecuted belief group suffering from stigmatization. Activists report cases of violence by family members, investigation by authorities, and general difficulties in educational, professional and social life. Whilst we welcome the King's instruction to review and rewrite religious textbooks and religious curricula used in public and private school, with the stated goal of removing any extremist or intolerance reference and promoting moderation, tolerance and coexistence, we believe that the Kingdom needs to do more to promote the rights of freedom of religion or belief and plurality of opinions. A state should grant freedom of religion to all its citizens and not just to those fortunate enough to agree with the religious belief of the state they live in. We urge Morocco to consider this and put in place remove and appeal its laws discriminating on the grounds of religious belief. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies.
Mr. President, we are delivering this statement on behalf of Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies and a number of human rights organizations in Morocco. Mr. President, the practice of freedoms have seen a lot of violations, including cracking down on human rights defenders, whether by prosecuting them or intentional assaults by the police against them during protests. Second, denying a large number of human rights organizations of their right to assembly and association, despite the fact that some of them have already had final court judgments in their favor under the pretext that they are upsetting the efforts of security apparatus in counter-terrorism. The exercise of disproportionate power in breaking the peaceful protests like what happened in Reef protests in the north of Morocco, where the police forces called the protesters foundlings and Spaniards for using penal code in the cases of publishing and journalism while unjustly prosecuting media professionals and journalists. Mr. President, we are calling upon the government of Morocco to commit to their voluntary obligations before you and to domesticate their laws with international instruments. We are also calling Morocco to respect the rights contained in their legislations. We also call it to hold perpetrators responsible, accountable, and to put an end to the national strategy for impunity. Thank you.
Now I call on the World Borough Organization.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to insist on the fact that the deprivation of the Sahrawi people of their rights is an ipso facto denial of all their fundamental rights, as we see under 1514. The invasion of territory by the Kingdom of Morocco has been described as deplorable by the Security Council. The Kingdom of Morocco has continued to fail to respect the minimum international legal and humanitarian standards. Little attention has been given the issue of self-determination of Western Sahara and other human rights violations. We would draw this Council's attention to the situation of the Sahrawi people, particularly in the Demizif area, which suffered severe sanctions. This was as a result of torture and degrading treatment. On 27 July 2017, the Court of Cassation in Morocco turned over the military court decision based on a lack of evidence. The UN Committee Against Torture noted that the Kingdom of Morocco had violated Articles 1, 12, 13, 14, and 16. The Civil Tribunal has also imposed courts a sentence as severe as the other courts. The prisoners have been dispersed to different Moroccan prisons far from the Western Sahara territory, where their loved ones and family members live. That makes it very difficult. On this topic, we would call upon the United Nations and the Human Rights Council to live up to their responsibilities, given this worrisome situation, which compels all necessary measures to be taken to bring the immediate release of the Sahrawi prisoners. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the Amnesty International.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. There's been a chilling wave of arrests of scores of activists in the Rif region, and peaceful protests have been forcibly dispersed, including those advocating for self-determination of Western Sahara. We welcome Morocco's commitment to remove obstacles in the registration of civil society organizations, to review the penal code in line with Article 9 of the ICCPR, and to ensure full respect for freedom of expression, association and assembly in Western Sahara. However, we regret Morocco's rejection of recommendations to end the persecution of journalists and to release those detained solely for exercising their right to freedom of expression. We acknowledge Morocco's commitment to guarantee fair trials. However, we urge it to amend the Code of Criminal Procedure to ensure access to a lawyer during interrogation. We have documented unfair trials both in Morocco and Western Sahara that relied on statements which defendants said had been extracted under torture. While we welcome steps to address violence against women and girls, we are concerned that the draft law on combating violence against women does not comply with international standards in its definition of rape. We welcome Morocco's acceptance of recommendations to criminalize marital rape and to ensure protection against domestic violence. However, we regret its rejection of recommendations to repeal articles in the Penal Code prohibiting same-sex sexual relations and sexual relations outside marriage. Despite some reform in policies on migration and refugees, Morocco has yet to adopt legislation to protect asylum seekers. We are pleased to note Morocco's commitment to align the legal framework on migration and asylum with the ICCPR. Although no executions have been carried out in Morocco since 1993, death sentences continue to be handed out, and proposed changes to the Penal Code would expand the scope of the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now I call on the Human Rights Watch.
Mr. Vice President, Human Rights Watch welcomes the UPR report on Morocco, which includes recommendations concerning joining the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, abolition of capital punishment, and equality among citizens. During Morocco's review in May 2017, delegations acknowledged Morocco's efforts to accede to international treaties, in particular its ratification of the International Convention for Enforced Disappearances and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. While Human Rights Watch acknowledges developments in advancing rights of domestic workers, victims of human trafficking, and persons with disabilities, we regret that the government rejected key recommendations on other important human rights concerns. These recommendations include withdrawing all reservations to the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, decriminalizing same-sex consensual relations, amending penal code provisions used to imprison journalists and others for non-violent speech, and eliminating family code provisions that discriminate against children born outside of wedlock. We urge the government to comply with the recommendations it has accepted, including ones that Morocco accepted during the second cycle of the Universal Periodic Review, but has yet to implement. Morocco's human rights record remains tainted by allegations of unjustified use of force by police against Hirak protesters in the Rif, the systematic suppression of pro-independence demonstrations by Sahrawis in Western Sahara, and the failure of courts trying politically charged cases to scrutinize the veracity of contested confessions to the police, contributing to trials that are hugely unfair. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on Liberation.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. Vice President, Western Sahara is a non-autonomous territory and is, as established by UN doctrine. And this is the case since 1973. The situation arises from the fact that it is the only non-autonomous, non-self-governing territory that does not have an administrating territory that takes on a mandate as under the UN Charter. What's more, in the report submitted by the state, in the UPR, and in the report from the working group, there's no description of what the situation is regarding the human rights for the Sahrawi people. We have heard from numerous NGOs speak of the situation of human rights in the Sahrawi refugee camps. This they describe as wretched conditions. Whether this is an NGO for children or OCAPROS, they have insisted before this Council on the importance of the human rights situation in the camps. We would like to draw the Council's attention to the need to send a technical mission to Western Sahara so that it might form an impartial report on the situation of these individuals on the ground. If the Kingdom of Morocco does not accept this technical mission, the Council can send to the refugee camps a team so that there can be an official report that is made public on the situation of the camps. We will save a great many minutes of speech-making if this were to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call on the Indigenous People of Africa Coordinating Committee. It's not available. Now I move to the International Council for support.
نتمنى على الدول اللي قدمت تعليقات وتوصيات مقترحة خلال استعراض الدوري الشامل.
We appreciate those who have made comments on the human rights situation in Morocco. Many countries have addressed the issue of Western Sahara, which is occupied by foreigners. The Kingdom of Morocco does not want for this to be addressed. We must adopt measures to ensure human rights, particularly in the light of the human rights violations in Western Sahara. At the 35th session, the High Commissioner noted that there was a debate or discussion with the government and that he wished to discuss these matters with the government of Morocco, but he did not speak of the Tindouf camp. It is time for the High Commissioner's office to note that the human rights violations are continuing in Western Sahara, which does not enjoy self-determination. The Tindouf camp has not made any progress in human rights, and we would call for political measures to be taken by the Kingdom of Morocco. An observer in the High Commissioner's office was a witness to the dispersal of protesters in the Rif region. No one has spoken of the military judgment or trial against human rights defenders. The Moroccan people enjoy their self-determination. However, the others are not. There is a confiscation of resources in that region, which does not, again, enjoy self-determination. The people do not have a right to self-determination, again, with an international administrator. Thank you.
Thank you. This was unfortunately the last speaker we can accommodate. Before giving the floor to the delegation of Morocco for its concluding remarks, allow me to note that based on the information provided, out of 244 recommendations received, 191 enjoy support while 53 are noted. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mustafa Ramad for his concluding remarks. Please.
شكرا سيادة الرئيس. حضرات.
Thank you, Vice President, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to try to respond to some of your comments while providing the following clarifications. First of all, I wish to thank the Council, this eminent Council, for allowing Morocco to set out its human rights achievements. We've had the opportunity to listen to your comments and recommendations. We are mindful of being among those who are the most receptive to comments, and these recommendations were very wise. So these recommendations that are in line with the provisions of the Moroccan Constitution, those which are in line with the Constitution, have been fully accepted and will be duly implemented into human rights laws that will enter force in 2018. Now, we are determined to establish a follow-up program for the implementation of the recommendations on human rights deriving from the UPR and the Human Rights Council. The Kingdom of Morocco, headed by King Mohammed VI, has taken big steps in protecting human rights. We will be continuing our efforts at all levels. especially in terms of judicial level, which guarantees fundamental freedoms. We've introduced numerous reforms to the judiciary in line with the provisions of the Constitution and in line with international standards, enshrining an independent judiciary which guarantees human rights as well as the rule of law, and this in coordination with all relevant European institutions. I would like to stress that the authorities of the Constitutional Tribunal have been expanded to include the authority to reject non-constitutionality of laws, and this is done as part of the guarantees for human rights. 2 laws indeed have been promulgated, first on the criminal code and another on criminal procedure to enshrine equitable trial within the constitutional and international and the relevant international commitments. We've also revised the authorities of the military courts to apply only to military crimes. Protection and bolstering human rights on the ground fall within the purview of the judiciary system that is due to hears complaints, reports of torture or mistreatment. Moreover, a recommendation on justice and reconciliation, on combating torture and mistreatment, as well as appropriate steps have been adopted to address these issues. There's also another draft law on fine-tuning the purview of the Human Rights Commission, which created a mechanism to combat torture which is consistent with the corresponding covenant. In last October, the Commission Against Torture will be received by Morocco in October for the Commission to consider the situation of torture in Morocco. Finally, my country, since this year we adopted legislation on the relevant human rights institutions that are in step with the Moroccan Constitution. Laws were adopted for combating discrimination, and the public policy has been adopted as well, also on education, healthcare, employment, which all feeds into the issue of human rights and which applies to the whole of the country. There's no difference between the south and the north. It's all done as part of comprehensive justice within the country, nationwide. Morocco believes that civil society is a vital partner in public policy, and this through the mechanisms enshrined in law, especially the law on petitions to local authorities or regional authorities, and we've also activated a participatory approach, which is a fundamental pillar for the government. So I stress the continued participation of civil society as we seek to bolster its capacities and to encourage its activities so that it can fulfill its pioneering role. In 2012, as I said, we committed to submitting a follow-up report as part of the UPR, this was to be a practice, and now we are ready to submit a follow-up report to set out progress in implementation of recommendations in my country. In conclusion, Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, allow me once more to affirm that the choice of democracy and of human rights is an irreversible choice. We pursue our efforts to that end. Morocco, in all its components, the king, the government and the people, the whole country is determined to pursue the establishment of democracy. What's more, we've taken great steps forward, and we want to stress the importance of this process with a view to building on our achievements already in that sphere, taking into account all the while of certain shortcomings, certain gaps, but we are ready to overcome all difficulties, and we will be pursuing fruitful, constructive cooperation with all the UN human rights mechanisms. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency for the invitation and for the fruitful participation of Morocco in the whole UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopts the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Morocco as it appears on the screen. I see no objection. The decision is adopted. Before we briefly suspend the meeting prior to proceeding with the consideration of the outcome of Indonesia, I would like to inform you that a request for the extension of the deadline has been made by Tunisia on behalf of the African group for tabling the draft resolution on the human rights in Burundi under item 10. Explanations have been provided. With your approval, an extension for tabling these two draft resolutions will be granted until 1 p.m. tomorrow. I take it that this is agreeable to all of you.